What's up guys, how you doing? Welcome to another History in Your Hand and another video of us sat right here in the office. So last week I put out a video about the top 5 misconceptions or top 5 myths of World War I of the Great War, and it seemed to be quite well received, and in fact my friend Chris over at Vlogging Through History very kindly did a reaction video to it, and so there's a whole load of new people here on the channel, so welcome to all of you guys. And I thought with the fact that that video seemed to be quite popular and the fact there is an awful lot of topics you can talk about when it comes to 5 misconceptions about the Great War, that I would make a part 2. And that's what we're doing right here. 5 myths from the First World War, part 2. So I suppose 10 myths, because we've already done 5 and today we're going to do a new 5. If you're interested in checking out part 1 of this video, I'm going to link it at the end, or you can go find it on my channel, then come back and watch part 2, whichever way you would like to do it. Before I get into it, I'm going to ask you guys to do all the usual YouTube stuff for me. Hit the like button, comment something below for me, subscribe if you haven't already, because it helps me out loads and loads on this channel. Right, let's get into it with myth number 1, or maybe we say myth number 6. And misconception number 1 is going to be to say that Germany started the war. It was all their fault. Now, don't get me wrong, Germany had a large part to play in the start of the Great War, but it wasn't entirely their fault. And in fact, in some cases, there was a bit of hesitation from Kaiser Wilhelm to get involved in conflict because he knew that it would bring Britain and various other countries into the war. A real flyby version of how the First World War started is Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of Austria, was assassinated. It was traced back to an extremist group in Serbia. Austria blamed Serbia and used it almost as an excuse to invade Serbia. Austria was allied with Germany, which meant that Germany supported Austria. Serbia was allied with Russia, which meant that Russia supported Serbia. Therefore, Germany and Russia were on opposing sides, and if there was an Austrian invasion of Serbia, it meant that Russia might declare war on Germany, Germany declare war on Russia. France was allied with Russia, so Germany knew if they went to war against Russia on one side of the country, they would then have to fight against France on the other side of the country. Britain was allied with France, which meant Germany knew that Britain was probably going to come into the war, and of course in the middle of all of that there's Belgium. But ultimately there was a lot of different causes for the Great War, and it wasn't entirely a case of Germany being at fault. I think sometimes there is a misconception that the war started with Germany just deciding, you know what, we're going to invade Belgium and France. And actually there was a lot more to it than that. Don't get me wrong though, ultimately Germany knew full well that if Austria was to invade Serbia, it would trigger the start of a European war. They supported Austria in doing that, so they do still hold account for part of the reason why the Great War started, but it wasn't a case that they were entirely to blame. Okay, moving into myth number 2, or shall we call it number 7. And that's to say that the Western Front was the main front of the fighting in World War I. Now, don't get me wrong, the Western Front was pretty substantial, and of course, especially to us Britons, it's the important front, right? Because that's where all of our troops fought. Well, not entirely where all of our troops fought, but certainly the main theatre of war for the British Army. However, when you compare the Western Front with the Eastern Front, on the side where Russia is positioned, actually it is a lot bigger. And when you look on a map and you see the Eastern and Western Front compared, the Eastern Front absolutely dwarfs the Western Front. Sometimes there is a misconception that the Western Front was the main piece, the biggest piece where all of the action happened, when actually that Eastern Front had a huge amount of fighting and is a lot bigger and a lot longer than the Western Front. Okay, moving into myth number 3, and that is to say that France rolled over and Britain had to go in and rescue them. I think sometimes there is a perception of this, probably with both of the world wars, that France just rolled over and Britain had to pile in and save them. Well, actually in the Great War, that is far from the truth. When Britain entered the Great War, they only held a small section of the front line. In 1914, it was about 21 miles long. Through the course of the war, that grew, and by 1918, the British Army held a section of the front that was 87 miles long. However, even then, at the point at which the British front line was at its largest, that still only represented less than 24% of the front line that France still held. When you look at a map of the Western Front, Britain held the kind of northwest section, not quite up to the top because Belgium had a bit up the top there as well, but then there is a huge amount of the front line moving down southeast past places like Verdun that the French held for the duration of the war. There was an awful lot of hard and tough fighting, and Verdun, a place where I hope to have future videos on the channel soon, it is a place where France had to go to war for the entire 4 years, and they did an awful lot of fighting. It was not a case of Britain being the main dominating force along that Western front line. Okay, moving into myth number 4, and that is to say that most of the soldiers who fought in the First World War were killed in action. Now, sometimes that is a big misconception. There were a huge amount of casualties in the Great War, and there are certain communities, especially here in the UK, that were absolutely decimated by the Great War. We've talked previously on the channel about the PALS battalions, where men from a certain town or village would all go and fight together, and if that unit or that regiment went into some particularly heavy fighting right on the front line, sometimes you did have towns or villages where loads and loads of the soldiers who went from that area were killed. However, in the bigger picture of the Great War, the British Army, for example, had about 700,000 men killed in action. Now, that's still a huge number, but ultimately it represents less than 12% of the total British soldiers who went and fought in the Great War. So whilst there was certainly a huge, in fact an unthinkable amount of people who were killed, and then of course more who were wounded on top of that, but the reality of it is that most of the men who went and fought in the Great War were not killed. Less than 12% actually lost their lives. And moving into myth number 5, or we can call it myth number 10. And that's to say that the Great War was very much a European war. Well, that's not the case at all. During the 4 years, 1914 to 1918, more than 30 different countries declared war. By 1918, we had countries from all around the world. The European countries, but of course countries like the United States were in the war by that stage, Italy, and a lot of other countries that you sometimes don't immediately think of when it comes to the Great War were all involved. The fighting, of course, was very heavy in Europe on the Western Front and the Eastern Front, but outside of that, there was fighting in Africa, in the Middle East, all around the world. It really was a global war and was not just restricted to Europe, which is often the misconception, I think, largely by a lot of British people, and certainly me before I started to really study the Great War, because naturally we start to learn about the Western Front in Europe, where most of the British troops fought. So there we go, that just about rounds off part 2 of our 5 myths from the Great War, giving us 10 misconceptions in total. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, do me a favour, hit that like button, make sure you stick around and watch some of our future videos. Guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.